Hi, this is Peter Brown. I'll be recording all the PowerPoints in a lecture format on YouTube. If I were you, what I would do is I would print off my homework. The homework will go right along with the PowerPoints, and so it will give you an activity as you're going along to fill in the PowerPoints. The PowerPoints come mostly from the textbook chapter. If there's something you don't understand, you might want to go back and read the OpenStax textbook and it will explain it further. If there are things in the textbook that I skipped, you can skip them too. I pulled out the highlights and the most important things from the textbook, but you are not responsible for the material and the topics that are not covered in the PowerPoints. Sometimes there will be things in the PowerPoints that are not in the textbook. So for example, there is a video on the Rock Pocket Mouse. You are responsible for that video. There are some other slides that I've added for various reasons, and you are responsible for those slides. Okay, so we're following along with the syllabus, and this lecture goes along with Chapter 1, An Introduction to the Study of Life. I'm going to start every chapter with pre-test questions or pre-chapter questions. The idea is to get you thinking about the topic and thinking about what you already know. Hopefully the first couple chapters will be things you're familiar with. The first chapter goes into what life is and some of the themes of life, and then we'll skip to the chapter on cells. And so most of you are familiar with these topics, so I think they're a little easier. So I thought they were good topics to start with. Okay, so go ahead and choose a characteristic that is not considered one of the properties of life. Okay, and so hopefully you picked C, moving. There are a lot of living things that do not move. Things like plants that are rooted in place. Things like lichen, which is the funny orange and green stuff growing on rocks. A lot of bacteria are non-modal. So even though we think of living things as moving, that's not necessarily a characteristic of life. Okay, the correct order from smaller to larger is. Okay, so life is studied at all sorts of different levels, and pick the smallest one to the largest one. Okay, so hopefully you picked B, molecules, things like DNA, and then cells. Cells are the smallest level of life that have all the properties of life, and then cells work together as tissues. Okay, evolution is a concept that the correct answer is D. All organisms are related by common ancestry. Later on in the course, we'll talk about things like DNA and genetic engineering. And so you can do funky things like take a human gene and put it into a bacteria and get it to express a human gene. Why is that? Because humans and bacteria share common ancestry from billions of years ago. The more closely we are related to an organism, the more recently our common ancestor. And so the closest relative of humans are chimpanzees, and we share a common ancestor from about 7 million years ago. That common ancestor was not human, it was not chimpanzee, it was an ancestor that gave rise to different lines of descent that 7 million years later we call humans and chimpanzee. Biology is a study of life. As far as we know, the only place life exists is on the planet Earth. Biology is a study of living organisms, and scientific knowledge is based on observation and experiments. Sometimes I sort of glide through what science is very quickly because I think, oh, everybody knows that. But with the recent coronavirus, it's pretty clear that a lot of people don't understand the difference between science and just throwing out whatever view you have in the corner coffee shop. Science is based on evidence. It's based on data, and it's just our best current explanation based on the current data. And as scientists, we want to be open to possibilities. And as new data emerges and new evidence emerges, we want to be open to new ideas. Here is cyanobacteria, some of the earliest life on Earth. They still exist today. And here are fossil stromatolites in Western Australia. And so these are fossilized remains of ancient cyanobacteria. So there are living things today that are close related to some of the earlier things on Earth that existed 3 billion years ago. So if you don't like listening to me speak and you just want to go through the slides by yourself, the slides are also available not on YouTube, but in a version to be downloaded. And you can just download these same slides and go over them yourself. I know some people are more text-based learners. They don't want to listen to the professor. And some people, they like to hear somebody explain things. So whichever way works for you, or maybe you want to do a little both. Maybe you want to hear me go through it and then download them so you can look through it on your own as well. Each of these is an individual cell, an individual organism. Sometimes they stick together. These are prokaryotic or bacterial cells called E. coli. Coli comes from colon and tells you that we have millions of these living in our digestive tract. And we're going to do the metric system in lab in a few weeks. And it tells you that they're a little bit over a micrometer long. A micrometer is, or a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Okay, so what does science do? It tries to explain how the natural world or the physical world works. There are no supernatural explanations allowed. So if your flashlight doesn't turn on, you can't say, well, the ghost was fooling around with it. That's why it doesn't turn on. It tries to give us the best current explanation based on our current knowledge. And we want to be open to new ideas. So as new evidence comes up, new scientific experiments, new techniques, new data, we want to be able to say, hey, maybe the dinosaurs didn't die off from the Ice Age. Maybe the evidence points to something else. So here's how science is done. And in laboratories, you'll get to have an opportunity to work and see for yourself. But usually it starts with an observation of the natural world. Then you ask a question. Finally, you form a hypothesis, which is a tentative explanation based on your current knowledge. And based on that hypothesis, if it's true, it should have good predictive value of how to run an experiment and what the results will be. So you set up an experiment to see if it meets your expectation. You analyze the results. And if the hypothesis is supported, then you can publish and report the results so other people can look at it. If the hypothesis is not supported, oftentimes you can publish your results as well. But you might say, this was my idea, it didn't support my hypothesis, now I have to revise my hypothesis and try again. So science is an iterative process, and sometimes in the literature, we see the final answer and the experiment that determined that final answer, but there are many, many experiments that are run and they get little pieces of the puzzle until we determine that final answer. So here's an example of how dinosaurs and our ideas are changing. So if you look at dinosaur fossils, they disappeared about 65 million years ago, and we know that from the fossil record. And so what caused the dinosaur extinction? For a long time when I was growing up, people said, oh, they became extinct because they didn't survive the Ice Age. So if that's true, then the dinosaur extinction should go along with an ice age. But what happens is the dinosaurs actually died out very quickly, whereas the ice age developed over a long, long period of time. And so the hypothesis was not supported. And so today we think that there was a meteor from outer space that landed near the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's what caused the dinosaur extinction. And later on, that gave rise to the Ice Age as well. But all the evidence supports that it's a meteor that really gave rise to the dinosaur extinction. So the kind of thing you might do is you might have two different people. One would be the sender, one would be the receiver, and you would separate them where they couldn't see each other, perhaps one out in the hall and one in the classroom, and you'd give each of them the same 10 pictures and have them pick one picture at random, have the sender pick a picture at random and send it and write down what picture he's looking at. Do it again every 30 seconds, have him do a different picture, and then have the receiver write down what pictures he thinks are being sent. And at the end of 5 minutes, if they get 30 seconds per picture, for example, there should be 10 different pictures sent. Perhaps a pair of scissors, a bicycle, a man, a woman, and so on. Okay? Since they guessed 10 times and there were 10 pictures, through random chance, you'd expect 1 out of 10 to be right. If you found a pair of people that could get, say, 4 or 5 out of 10 right every time, that would show evidence of telepathy. I've been doing this experiment in my class for about 20 years, and usually what we get right is based on random chance, but every once in a while I might get a little higher than random chance, and that's what you'd expect. Okay? So I've never found people that I'm sure are telepath, but you want to be open to that possibility. We are living things. We recognize other living things. But believe it or not, there's no simple definition for what makes something alive. Here are some properties of life that all living organisms share. So scientists say living things have order, they respond to stimuli, they reproduce, they grow and develop, there's regulation, there's homeostasis, and there's energy processing. You might not know if that's a toad or a frog, but you'd say, oh, that's some sort of amphibian. It's either a toad or a frog. And you'd recognize there's the head, there's the eye. There's certain structures and body parts. There's certain high order to living things that we recognize that something is an animal or something is a plant or something is a fungi. Living things respond to stimuli. These mimosa pudica plants are interesting. They're one of the few plants that respond to touch. And if you click one of the leaves or flick one of the leaves will fold up. What's the purpose of this? We think it may be to scare predators. So insects get scared when they land on it and it folds up. I don't know if it will work clicking on the link from YouTube. You may have to go to the downloaded version, but this just will show you how sunflowers track the sun. In the morning, they're facing the east to the rising sun, and during the day they'll actually grow, and the flower and leaves will rotate to follow the course of the sun, and so by the evening they'll be facing west. Here's an adorable picture of a mama cat and 3 baby kitty cats that illustrates growth and development. So growth is getting bigger, so an increase in cell size or cell number, and so we know the kittens are going to grow. Development is going through different stages, like a butterfly starting as a larva, a caterpillar, and then pupating and becoming a butterfly. In this case, early on, kittens are born with their eyes closed, and it takes a while for them to be able to open their eyes. They begin by feeding on their mother's milk, and later on they'll begin eating solid foods. So going through different stages of life is development. Regulation and homeostasis are closely related. So homeostasis is just having processes in balance. And the way living things get processes in balance is by regulation. So there are many things that are regulated in your body, your blood sugar, your pH. In this case, the illustration is temperature. How do polar bears stay warm? And they say, of course, they're generating heat, they're warm-blooded, but they also have a lot of fat and a lot of fur, and that keeps them warm. This is my first time using this textbook, and so somehow I didn't put the caption that this is illustrating energy processing. So the idea is that here's a California condor flying, and in order to fly, he has to use energy. We will learn of a chemical form of energy called ATP that's used by all living organisms. Now we'll talk a little bit how life is organized on different levels, going from the smallest and simplest level, the level of atoms and molecules, to the level of the cell, to multicellular organisms, to tissues working together, to organs and organ systems, and then organisms as a population, all the rabbits in the field, all the bacteria in your small intestine, and so on. If you look at the next slide, usually when we think about living things, we think about a single living thing, a single organism, either a single bacteria or a single tree or a single plant. But if you go down to the smaller group, we are made of organ systems, our respiratory system, our nervous system, our circulatory system. When you study human anatomy and physiology, you'll study the different systems. These systems are made of organs. So our respiratory system is made of our lungs. It's made of our mouth. It's made of all the parts that help us breathe. Okay? And then tissues are cells working together. Cells have subcellular structures called organelles, and smaller than that, all cells are made of atoms and molecules. So those are the smallest level of life that we care about. When you go larger than the organism, a group of an organism is a population. Populations interact with other populations in communities. So people interact with plants and other animals. And then finally you have ecosystems, things like a desert or a forest. And ecosystems include both living and non-living variables. So the water and the air and all the sort of things we interact with. And finally, the biosphere is the entire planet Earth and all the non-living and living parts that keep us alive. So here are pictures showing you that organelles are subcellular structures within the cell. So here are nuclei within an onion cell, these little dots here that hold the DNA. Here are cells, so here are some human blood cells. Going larger still, cells work together to make tissues. Here's some skin tissue. Then tissues work together to make organs and organ system. So here's the digestive system, which includes the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder, and so on. Okay? And then you get an organism. An organism would be a single tree. A population would be a group of trees. A community would be the trees along with the ants and the rabbits and some of the other organisms living within the forest. And finally, the ecosystem would be the entire forest, and it would include both the trees and the rabbits and the ants, as well as the air and the water. And finally, the biosphere encompasses all the ecosystems on the planet Earth. So here's the caption from the previous slide. Okay, so this is something we'll talk about this semester, and I think it's overlooked a little bit in your book. So here's something I added. There's a relationship between structure and function at all levels. So when you take human anatomy and physiology, the anatomy is the structure of the human body, and the physiology is how it functions. And obviously they're related. So one of the unique things about primates, the order that includes monkeys and man, is we're able to grasp things because we have an opposable thumb, a thumb that can touch our fingers. Think about if your dog went to grab a ball, it couldn't grab it with its hand. And so here's a primate that's grabbing onto the rope, and it's grabbing onto a branch. We share certain characteristics with other primates because we share common ancestry with these primates. The more closely organisms resemble one another, more features they share, the more closely they're related evolutionarily. And now we have a really big breakthrough that we can look at the DNA. And so instead of looking at two Mario games and say, yeah, they're both Mario games, now you can look at the computer code and see how they're related in terms of the DNA. So take a minute. Here's a handsome orangutan, and here's a human, and this was at Boston Harbor near the Boston Aquarium a few years ago. And tell me, what are some of the characteristics that, even though it's clear that an orangutan is not a human, and if you go to the Phoenix Zoo, they have orangutans, that we share a common ancestor? We think about 12 million years ago. So we're not as closely related to orangutans as we are to the chimpanzee. Okay, so we both have opposable thumbs. We both have fur on our body. We both happen to have a big belly. You might have been polite enough not to say that out loud, even though you thought it. Okay, so we both have eyes in the front of our heads. Things that are predators tend to have eyes in the front of their heads. Things like cows that are prey tend to have their eyes more on the side of their heads. So there are a lot of characteristics that show we share common ancestry. If you did an MRI or looked at the inside would be similar as well. We would share common systems. Okay, this links to the video about the rock pocket mouse that shows evolution in action. I'll ask you a question on your quiz and a question on your exam about this video. And there's a worksheet on your Canvas and an assignment to fill in the worksheet as you go through the rock pocket mouse video. Here's the worksheet. And so if you want to just do it right from here, you can print this off, and it's the same worksheet, and then you'll submit it through Canvas. So down here is the original cell that gave rise to all forms of life. The original form of life were bacteria. They're the simplest form of life. They arose over 3 billion years ago. A second group of living organisms that arose a little later than bacteria are called the archaea. We only found out about the archaea in the 1970s when Carl Woese analyzed chemically some bacteria that lived in extreme environments, and he found that they were so different from bacteria that they were actually a different cell type, and they still are alive today, although they're hard to study because oxygen poisons most of them. Most of them will only live in oxygen-free environments like the early Earth. And then finally, eukarya. Eukarya are the kind of cell type for all the multicellular organisms. And so that includes humans, but there are also a lot of single-celled eukarya out there as well. So the three domains of life, the three basic cell types, are bacteria. You'll study them a lot if you go on and take microbiology. And we'll study bacteria a little bit this year. We have a real exciting lab on bacteria we're doing in a few weeks. Archaea and the eukarya, most of our time this semester will be spent on the eukarya. So that concludes Chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it. And let me stop.